Hello, and welcome back to Story Time with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off on George's marvelous medicine, George had given the medicine to his grandma, and she grew so tall that she went through the roof of the house. We're now about to find out what happens next. Ready? Alright. Let's begin, and I'll read the next 4 chapters tonight. Chapter 8. The Brown Hen. George stood in the farmyard, looking up at the roof. The old farmhouse had a fine roof of pale red tiles and tall chimneys. There was no sign of Grandma. There was only a song thrush sitting on one of the chimney pots, singing a song. The old Wurzels got stuck in the attic, George thought. Thank goodness for that. Suddenly a tile came clattering down from the roof and fell into the yard. The thrush took off fast and flew away. Then another tile came down, then half a dozen more. And then, very slowly, like some weird monster rising up from the deep, Grandma's head came through the roof. Then her scrawny neck, and the tops of her shoulders. "How am I doing, boy?" she shouted. "How's that for a bash-up?" "Don't you think you ought better stop now, Grandma?" George called out. "I have stopped," she answered. "I feel terrific. Didn't I tell you I had magic powers? Didn't I warn you I had wizardry in the tips of my fingers? You wouldn't listen to me, would you? You wouldn't listen to your old Grandma." "You didn't do it, Grandma," George shouted back to her. "I did it. I made you a new medicine." "A new medicine? You? What rubbish!" she yelled. I did, George shouted. "You're lying as usual," Grandma yelled. "You're always lying." "Really, Grandma? You and that nonsense about being one with magic powers." "I'm not lying, Grandma. I swear I'm not." The wrinkled old face high up on the roof stared down suspiciously at George. "Are you telling me you actually made a new medicine all by yourself?" she shouted. "Yes, Grandma, all by myself." "I don't believe you," she answered, "but I'm very comfortable up here. Fetch me a cup of tea." A brown hen was pecking about in the yard close to where George was standing. The hen gave him an idea. Quickly he uncorked the medicine bottle and poured some of the brown stuff into the spoon. "Watch this, Grandma," he shouted. He crouched down, holding out the spoon to the hen. "Chicken," he said. Chicken. Come here. Have some of this." Chickens are stupid birds, and very greedy. They think everything is food. Go figure. This one thought the spoon was full of corn. It hopped over. It put its head on one side and looked at the spoon. "Come on, chicken," George said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." The brown hen stretched out its neck towards the spoon and went peck. It got a beakful of medicine. The effect was electric. "Hurry!" shrieked the hen, and it went straight up into the air like a rocket. It went as high as the house. Then down it came again, into the yard, splosh, and there it sat with its feathers all sticking straight out from its body. There was a look of amazement on its silly face. George stood watching it. Grandma up on the roof was watching it too. The hen got to its feet. It was rather shaky. It was making funny gurgling noises in its throat. Its beak was opening and shutting. It seemed like a pretty sick hen. "You've done it in, you stupid boy," Grandma shouted. "The hen's going to die. Your father will be after you now. He'll give you socks and serve you right." I don't even want to know what that means. All of a sudden, black smoke started pouring out of the hen's beak. "It's on fire!" Grandma yelled. "The hen's on fire!" George ran to the water trough to get a bucket of water. That hen'll be roasted and ready for eating any moment, Grandma shouted. I'd be more than happy to eat that chicken. I'm kidding. George sloshed the bucket of water over the hen. There was a sizzling sound, and the smoke went away. Old hen's laid its last egg, Grandma shouted. Hens don't do any laying after they've been on fire. Now that the fire was out, the hen seemed better. It stood up properly. It flapped its wings. Then it crouched down low to the ground as though getting ready to jump. It did jump. It jumped high in the air and turned a complete somersault, then landed back on its feet. It's a circus hen, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. It's a flipping acrobat. Now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. It's growing. It's growing, he yelled. It's growing, Grandma. Look, it's growing. Bigger and bigger, taller and taller it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times its normal size. Can you see it, Grandma? George shouted. I can see it, boy, the old woman shouted back. I'm watching it. George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement, pointing at the enormous hen and shouting, It's had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing just like you did. But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way Grandma grew. When Grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. The hen didn't. It stayed nice and plump all along, as you can see in these pictures. Soon it was taller than George, but it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until it was about as big as a horse. Then it stopped. Looks bigger than a horse to me. Doesn't it look marvelous, Grandma? George shouted. It's not as tall as me, Grandma sang out. Compared to me, that hen is titchy small. I am the tallest of them all. And that's a rhyme. Chapter 9. The Pig, the Bullocks, the Sheep, the Pony, and the Nanny Goat. At that moment, George's mother came back from shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and got out. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries. How about that then, eh, Mary? Grandma shouted. I'll bet you've never seen a hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is. But, stammered George's mother. It's George's magic medicine, Grandma shouted. Correction, George's marvelous medicine. Oh well. We both of us had it, the hen and I. But how in the world did you get up on the roof? Cried the mother. I didn't, cackled the old woman. My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room. This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped. She looked as though she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Cranky. Killy? Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with because even the smallest things got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping about as though something was burning his feet. Great heavens! He cried, waving his arms. What's this? What's happened? Where did it come from? It's a giant hen. Who did it? I did, George said. Yes, George, we know you did. Look Look at me, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. Never mind about the hen. What about me? Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma. Shut up, Grandma, he said. They obviously don't get along with each other. Go figure. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He had never seen anything like it. But then, who had? I haven't. It's fantastic, Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing around and around. It's colossal. It's gigantic. It's tremendous. It's a miracle. How did you do it, George? George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went cluck, 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 cluck. Everyone stared at it. When it stood up again, there was a brown egg laying there. The egg was the size of a football. That egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people, Mrs. Cranky said. George, Mr. Cranky shouted, how much of this medicine have you got? Lots, George said. There's a big pot full in the kitchen, and this bottle here is nearly full. Come with me, Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. Bring the medicine. For years and years I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton. They went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of the medicine to the pig. The pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place. Then it grew and grew. In the end, it looked like this. Like Fantastic Mr. Fox, apparently Roald Dahl wanted to make illustrations for George's marvelous medicine as well, as he's showing us how the animals looked like after George gives him the marvelous medicine. They went to the herd of fine black bullocks that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some medicine, and this is what happened. Then the sheep, he gave some to his grey pony, Jack Frost. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. Chapter 10. A Crane for Grandma. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the center of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. Hey you, she yelled. George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast. Don't listen to the old goat, Mr. Cranky said. She's stuck where she is, and a good thing too. But we can't leave her up there, Dad, George said. What if it rains? Good point, huh? George, Grandma yelled. Oh, you horrible little boy, you disgusting little worm. Fetch me a cup of tea at once and a slice of currant cake. We'll have to get her out, Dad, George said. She won't give us any peace if we don't. Mrs. Cranky came outside and she agreed with George. She's my own mother, she said. She's a pain in the neck, Mr. Cranky said. I don't care, Mrs. Cranky said. I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life. So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels, and there were 2 men inside it. The crane men climbed up onto the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. My God, look how tall she's become. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, unfortunately. But fortunately, it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto his back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Out of my way! Clear the decks! Stand back, all you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death!" And other silly things like that. I do love these illustrations. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. Chapter 11. Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvelous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant stewing pot had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be toast. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world, so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvelous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at $10 apiece." Of course, this book was written in 1981, so I'm sure it's more than that now. "We will become rich, and you will become famous. But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners. And one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." Excuse me. "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "To heck with my cornflakes," cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. "Come on, George. Let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is make one more stew pot full as a tester." "But, Dad," said little George, the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into the pot as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But, Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make sure we've got it right, and after that we'll all shout hooray and build the giant factory." "But, Dad, come on then, what is it you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the pot to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end, you see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in? I went up to the bathroom first, George said. I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table. Come on then, cried Mr. Cranky. Up we go to the bathroom. When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosol cans and empty bottles. That's great, said Mr. Cranky. That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it. So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. A box of powder, said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. Helga's hair set, flowers of turnips perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next? To the laundry room, George said. But are you sure you haven't missed anything up here, Dad? That's up to you, my boy, Mr. Cranky said. Have I? I don't think so, George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. My goodness me, what a mass of stuff you used, he cried. No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot? No, Dad, it's not, George said, and he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. Anything else? Mr. Cranky said. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Killy Cranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and brought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on his list. He then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. Now show me how you did it, George, he said. Come along. Show me exactly how you mixed them all together. To be continued.